there's more reaction to the recently released statistics from the Vatican regarding the number of Catholics worldwide. The study found there are 1.39 billion Catholics, or 17.7% of the world's population. That marks a one-year increase of nearly 14 million. But in other areas, there are some worrying numbers. The study found that for the fifth consecutive year, the total number of Catholic priests in the world declined. According to the Vatican, there are around 407,000 priests globally, a net reduction of 142. The biggest drop was in Europe, which had a decline of 2,745. But in Africa and Asia, the number of priests rose. Africa saw an increase of 1,600 priests, while Asia experienced an upswing of more than 1,100. And for analysis of all these numbers, we turn now to A.C. Wimmer, editor-in-chief of CNA Deutsch. A.C., always great to have you on. First off, your take on these numbers from the Vatican and what jumped out to you the most?
Thanks, Trace. It's great to be here. Look, heaps of things jumping out. Of course, on the one hand, this massive growth that you're seeing in Asia, in Africa, and then on the other hand, the decline in Europe. But it's one thing to look at the actual numbers and another thing to look at the quality. The quantity may be clear. Catholic population in Europe decreasing by almost 500,000 people. And then what you're looking at then, though, are the actual causes and how that relates to people. We recently saw with the trip of Pope Francis to Belgium, really negative reactions coming out of even Belgian bishops to some of the things Pope Francis said. And that is the kind of fueling of negative sentiments that leads to also then a loss of influence of religious life. And you combine that with other qualitative factors, like an aging population that perhaps also has less babies, there's a lower birth rate in Europe, and you come up with a sort of a dynamic here that we're witnessing. And that in particular for Europe is part of the story that we need to tell, that we as Catholics need to be aware of.
Yeah, and on the flip side, in Africa, the Vatican found there was a rise of 7 million Catholics there, and that was just 1 year. Talk to us about that and what's fueling this.
It's fascinating. And I was talking to African colleagues just here in Rome the other day about it. And clearly the picture is the same that you're getting from scientists looking at this, social scientists, as much as people specializing in the situation in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, Tracy. And it is this: they have strong family values. They have more children, higher birth rates, and evangelization efforts are bearing fruit. The work of the missionaries, be they European, American, or African now increasingly, is bearing fruit. The church is seen as a source for hope, for community. There are social services involved, and there is a clarity of teaching from most of the bishops there. There is a lack of ambivalence that you're seeing coming out of some of these other bishops, particularly in Europe, of course, as we all know. And that leads to an increase in number of African clergy and religious at the same time. So it's a really positive, almost like a power dynamic that's happening there in Africa.
Yeah, really bright spot right there. I also want to talk about this. We mentioned the decline in priests for a fifth consecutive year. Let's talk a bit more about that and how worrying is this trend?
Look, you ask the experts and you'll get different answers on that. The global number has decreased, but it is only by a small figure. If you look at, sort of 3 digits, maybe 140-ish, and the total number, which is over 400,000, one might say, and some do, that's a smidgen, that's almost nothing. But at the same time, as before with the other aspects, you're dealing with things that are beyond the numbers also important. Namely, there's an aging clergy population in Europe and in North America, as we know in particular. But there's also fewer vocations in Catholic countries, at least on the diocesan level, especially in so-called progressive countries, secular countries, although traditional Catholic areas and traditional Catholic institutions are flourishing in some places. And then there is a rise in other people working in a pastoral care sort of environment that can be very positive. So you see a rise in permanent deacons, and you see a rise in pastoral carers and things like that. Plus, of course, you see an increase in priests elsewhere. When you look at Africa, so I was saying 140 priests less, but in Africa it's 1,600 or so more. In Asia, over 1,000 more priests. That overall picture, therefore, is actually quite positive despite the decline in priests.
Well, AC, thank you so much for weighing in and unpacking all this for us. We really appreciate it. God bless.
Likewise, thank you.